The morning light broke across the Pacific with a deceptive beauty that belied the violence about to unfold. In the wardroom of the USS Enterprise, officers crowded around maps and intelligence reports, their faces etched with the weight of knowledge. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had accomplished what seemed impossible. They had penetrated the secrets of the Japanese naval code JN-25, exposing Admiral Yamamoto's entire operational blueprint. The Japanese would strike Midway at dawn on June 4, 1942, unaware that their every move had been anticipated. Their surprise turned into a carefully constructed trap. Norman Jack Dusty Cly represented a new generation of American naval aviators, men who had entered the service with optimism and patriotic fervor, only to discover that modern warfare demanded precision, courage, and the willingness to accept horrifying odds. Born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, Cly had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938 and earned his pilot's wings in April 1941. By the time he stood in the ready room before dawn on June 4th, he had already flown combat missions during the Marshall Islands raids, yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the next few hours would demand. The Air Group commander, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., a 1926 Academy graduate who had assumed leadership of Enterprise's Air Group just 2 months prior, addressed his pilots with clinical precision. The intelligence picture was stark. Approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway Island, 4 Japanese fleet carriers steamed toward their objective. These were not ordinary warships. The Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, and the Kaga were massive vessels that had participated in the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The Soryu and Hiryu, newer and faster, were equally formidable. Together, these 4 carriers constituted the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific. They carried 248 aircraft crewed by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The Japanese plan, McCluskey explained, possessed an elegance that bordered on the elaborate. Invasion forces would approach from the southwest, while a diversionary attack occurred in the Aleutian Islands. Admiral Yamamoto himself remained 300 miles behind the main force aboard the battleship Yamato, commanding the operation from a distance. The carrier strike force would launch its assault on Midway at approximately 0430 hours. And when American carriers inevitably responded to defend the atoll, Nagumo would be waiting to spring his ambush. What Yamamoto and his subordinates did not comprehend was that the Americans were already positioned, already waiting, already preparing to transform the hunters into the hunted. As dawn broke on June 4th, the flight deck of the Enterprise became a controlled frenzy of activity. Deck crews wearing their distinctive colored jerseys, red for ordnance, purple for fueling, brown for maintenance, performed their specialized tasks with practiced efficiency. Aircraft were positioned, engines warmed, and weapons loaded. Norman Cly performed his pre-flight inspection on his SBD Dauntless, Bureau number 639, with meticulous attention. The Dauntless was not the fastest dive bomber in service, capable of only 255 miles per hour at maximum velocity, but it possessed remarkable stability in a dive and could absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. His rear gunner, John Snowden from Illinois, checked the twin .30-caliber machine guns with the calm professionalism of a man who had already proven his worth in combat. The fuel calculations were critical. With 230 gallons in the main tank plus 2 58-gallon wing tanks, Cly would have approximately 4.5 hours of flight time if he managed fuel consumption carefully. The intercept point lay 175 miles distant, and the return journey would consume fuel at an alarming rate. Pilots understood that they were operating at extreme range, with minimal reserves for contingencies. The Zero fighters that escorted Japanese carriers were superior in maneuverability, and the Japanese pilots possessed experience accumulated over years of combat in China and the Pacific. American pilots would be flying inferior aircraft against more experienced opponents, a mathematical reality that made the coming battle a contest between technology and courage on one side and skill and experience on the other. At 0700 hours, the Enterprise launched its strike force. First came the fighters, 20 F-4F Wildcats destined to provide combat air patrol. Then the torpedo bombers took to the sky, 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, their Mark 13 torpedoes slung beneath their fuselages. These aircraft were already obsolete, slow, and vulnerable, and everyone who watched them lumber down the flight deck recognized that their crews were flying machines that had been rendered nearly suicidal by the evolution of carrier warfare. Finally came the dive bombers. Scouting Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, a Pearl Harbor veteran known for his meticulous professionalism, launched 18 aircraft. Bombing Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Richard Best, who studied the weather conditions with a pilot's careful attention to wind direction and cloud formations, contributed 15 planes. McCluskey would lead the combined strike force, shepherding the dive bombers toward their objective. The climb to altitude required patience and careful navigation. By 086 hours, the Enterprise's 33 dive bombers had reached 19,000 feet and were flying northwest in radio silence. The planned rendezvous with aircraft from the USS Hornet never materialized. McCluskey made the tactical decision to proceed independently rather than waste precious fuel waiting. The ocean below seemed infinite and empty, painted in shades of blue and gray. Pilots constantly checked their instruments, verified their bomb releases, and calculated fuel consumption. At this altitude, each pilot would have perhaps 10 seconds to line up on his target and release his ordnance. There would be no second chances, no opportunities for corrections or adjustments. The intercept point came and went with no sign of the Japanese fleet. Empty ocean stretched in all directions. Fuel gauges moved inexorably downward. Pilots performed rapid mental calculations. Perhaps 30 minutes remained before they would be forced to turn back or ditch in the Pacific. The radio silence that had been imposed to prevent detection now felt oppressive, isolating each pilot with his thoughts and fears. Then, at 0955 hours, McCluskey waggled his wings. Looking downward, the pilot spotted a white wake against the blue ocean, a lone destroyer racing toward the northeast. McCluskey banked to follow, making an intuitive gamble that this escort vessel was returning to the main fleet. For 20 agonizing minutes, the dive bombers pursued that destroyer while fuel reserves dwindled toward critical levels. At 10:20 hours, the Japanese fleet materialized below like toys scattered across a carpet. 4 carriers arranged in 2 groups, surrounded by an escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, their white wakes indicating constant maneuvering. Most remarkably, the sky above the fleet contained no Japanese fighters. The Zeros had been committed to low-altitude combat against the American torpedo bombers, leaving the carriers vulnerable to precisely the attack that was about to be delivered. McCluskey's voice crackled across the radio. "Scouting 6, take the left carrier. Bombing 6, take the right." In the confusion of battle, both squadrons converged on the Kaga, but Cly pushed his Dauntless into a steep dive regardless of the target assignment. The acceleration was brutal, pressing him back into his seat. The altimeter unwound as he descended. 18,000 feet, 15,000, 12,000, 12,000. The carrier grew in his bomb sight. He could see individual aircraft on the Kaga's deck, fuel hoses snaking between them, bombs on carts positioned nearby. The Japanese were in the midst of rearming their aircraft for a second strike on Midway. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, the instant when hundreds of men and millions of dollars worth of equipment were concentrated in the most destructive configuration imaginable. At 10,000 feet, Cly saw Earl Gallagher release his bomb. The projectile struck near the Kaga's island superstructure, and fire erupted instantly. Bodies were blown into the air. At 2,500 feet, Cly pressed his release button and hauled back on the control stick with all his strength. 9 Gs of force crushed him into his seat, his vision tunneling to a narrow point as the Dauntless groaned and flexed, its wings bending under the enormous strain. He leveled out just above the water, racing away from the carrier. Behind him, John Snowden shouted confirmation of a direct hit on the Kaga's forward elevator. Banking left, Cly observed his bomb had struck perfectly, the forward deck now engulfed in flames. Gallagher's bomb had hit aft. Other pilots' ordnance found their marks. Within seconds, 4 direct hits had transformed the Kaga into an inferno that burned from stem to stern. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Dick Best realized that both American squadrons were attacking the same target. Rather than adding redundant firepower to the Kaga, he and his 2 wingmen peeled off and attacked the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Best's 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the Akagi's flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay, among aircraft that were armed and fueled and loaded with ordnance. The Akagi became a pillar of flame and smoke. At exactly 7:22 hours, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived and attacked the Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck the carrier within 30 seconds. The explosion was catastrophic, a fire column reaching 1,000 feet into the air. 3 Japanese fleet carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been mortally wounded in less than 5 minutes. The scene that unfolded below was apocalyptic. The Kaga had become a floating volcano, explosions rippling through her hull, her massive forward elevator. Tons of steel blown completely off the deck to spin through the air before crashing into the ocean hundreds of yards away. Tiny figures, individual sailors, jumped from burning decks into oil-covered water. The Akagi burned from bow to stern, her deck buckling from the intense heat. The Soryu listed heavily, her hull ripped open by explosions before rolling over and slipping beneath the waves. Over 700 men went down with her in less than 20 minutes. The transformation from operational carrier to submarine tomb had taken only a moment in time. But one carrier remained operational, hidden 10 miles to the north by a rain squall. The Hiryu was launching counterstrikes against the American carriers. As Cly struggled to maintain altitude with his fuel reserves critically depleted, Japanese Zeros appeared at 3 o'clock high. Snowden's machine guns chattered in response as 2 fighters dove on the Dauntless. Cly pushed forward, using his aircraft's superior diving speed to evade. Tracers ripped past the cockpit. Snowden's guns fell silent momentarily, and Cly asked urgently about his gunner's status. "Hit, but okay. Got one," Snowden replied. A Zero trailed smoke, spinning toward the ocean. But more Japanese fighters were approaching. Cly stayed low, jinking constantly, his fuel gauge bouncing toward empty. The flight back to the Enterprise became a nightmare of fuel management and desperate calculations. The gauge read empty, but experience taught that a few gallons usually remained, though inaccessible through normal means. Cly leaned the fuel mixture until the engine ran rough, risking fouled spark plugs in exchange for a few additional minutes of flight time. Around him, other Dauntlesses struggled. Some trailed smoke from flak damage. Others had engines cutting out from fuel starvation. Radio channels filled with desperate transmissions, engine cutting out, going in, ditching, mark position. Enterprise, multiple aircraft emergency fuel. 2. Dauntlesses ahead of Clyde descended toward the water in controlled ditches. One pilot managed to land his aircraft with some semblance of control, and he and his gunner climbed onto the wing before the aircraft sank. Cly's engine sputtered as he consumed the last accessible fuel. Then the USS Enterprise appeared on the horizon. The carrier was turning into the wind for recovery operations. Cly's transmission was urgent. Emergency fuel. Request immediate landing. The reply came back. You're number 3. Watching the two aircraft ahead land consumed precious seconds. Each landing seemed to consume an eternity. Cly's engine was missing badly, running on fumes. As he entered the landing pattern, the engine quit completely. He was now committed to a dead-stick approach with no power, only altitude and airspeed. One chance remained. He lowered the landing gear, extended the flaps, and aimed for the third arresting wire. The landing signal officer signaled cut. Cly was too high. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The propeller windmilled uselessly as the flight deck rushed upward. His wheels hit the deck and bounced. The tailhook caught the arresting wire, and the Dauntless slammed to a stop with a violence that drove the wind from his lungs. Deck crews were already running before the propeller stopped rotating. "Get us out, wounded!" they shouted. John Snowden was pulled from the rear gunner's position, conscious but wounded in the shoulder and leg. He would survive. Cly's aircraft, SBD Bureau number 639, had accumulated over 40 bullet and shrapnel holes. How the aircraft had held together at all remained a mystery. The ready room was somber despite the victory. Of the 14 torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 6, only 4 had returned. 10 crews were gone. The news from the USS Hornet was worse. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had been completely wiped out. 15 aircraft had launched. Only one pilot, George Gay, had survived, floating in his life raft as he watched the American dive bombers attack the carriers. Waldron's last transmission before his aircraft exploded had been characteristically defiant. "We will go in. We won't turn back. Good luck." Not one torpedo had found its mark, but the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 had pulled Japanese fighters down to low altitude, leaving the carriers exposed to the dive bombers that followed. McCluskey entered the ready room with his shoulder bandaged from a 20mm shell fragment. "We got 3, he announced. "Kaga, Akagi," Soryu finished. Intelligence officers provided additional details. The Yorktown had been hit by 3 bombs at noon and 2 torpedoes at 14:30 hours, listing heavily before being abandoned. Yet her sacrifice had bought time to locate the Hiryu. Japanese casualties were mounting, approximately 2,000 dead so far, with each carrier carrying 1,200 to 500 crew members, plus airmen, few of whom were rescued. Each number represented a human being, someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father, dying in fire and water thousands of miles from home for an empire's ambition. That afternoon, American pilots launched again. 24 dive bombers found the Hiryu at 1700 hours. They placed 4 bombs into the carrier, setting her ablaze. She burned through the night before her crew scuttled her the following morning. The Kido Butai, the mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, ceased to exist. In the days that followed, American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. The cruiser Mikuma was sunk. The strategic implications became immediately apparent to military analysts and political leaders alike. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day, vessels that had required years to construct and could not be quickly replaced. More significantly, Japan had lost over 3,000 trained sailors and airmen, including more than 100 veteran pilots who possessed years of experience and an intuitive understanding of carrier operations that could not be taught in a classroom. The Japanese Navy never recovered from this catastrophe. The nation had started the war with 6 large fleet carriers and now retained only 2. New carriers could be built, but the trained pilots who could make those carriers effective could not be rapidly produced. The battle's strategic significance extended beyond the immediate tactical victory. American intelligence, derived from the breaking of the Japanese naval code, had provided the crucial advantage that allowed the United States to overcome its numerical disadvantage. Without the intelligence provided by Rochefort's codebreakers, American forces would have been reacting to Japanese movements rather than anticipating them, arriving late to battles fought on Japanese terms. The battle revealed critical weaknesses in Japanese planning. Admiral Yamamoto's operational plan had been too complex, with forces scattered thousands of miles apart, unable to support one another when circumstances deviated from the theoretical plan. Radio silence, imposed to prevent detection, had prevented effective coordination when the plan began to unravel. Japanese commanders had underestimated American capabilities and had assumed that American forces would react to Japanese initiatives in predictable, scripted ways. Admiral Nagumo faced an impossible dilemma when scouts reported American ships at 0728 hours. He was in the midst of rearming his aircraft for a second strike against Midway. Should he launch his aircraft immediately against the American carriers, or should he wait to properly arm them with the optimal ordnance for anti-ship warfare? His hesitation lasted approximately 30 minutes, a crucial window of time during which American dive bombers were already climbing to attack altitude. By the time Japanese aircraft were ready to launch, American bombs were already falling on Japanese carriers. That night, as the USS Enterprise steamed southwest through waters lit by stars that seemed indifferent to human suffering, Norman Cly stood on deck in contemplation. The same stars had looked down on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. He had witnessed the deaths of 4 carriers, the same type of vessels that had devastated American forces in Hawaii. Adrenaline had been replaced by exhaustion and a hollowness that no amount of sleep could fill. He thought about the torpedo crews who had flown to virtually certain death. John Waldron and his men had known that TBD devastators were obsolete death traps against Zeros, yet they had maintained their courses even as their aircraft were shot to pieces around them. Waldron's plane had exploded in a ball of fire. Other devastators had cartwheeled into the ocean, their pilots and gunners burning as they fell. George Gay had floated in the water for 30 hours, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid detection by Japanese ships, watching the ocean around him fill with the bodies of his friends and squadron mates. The psychological scars inflicted by such experiences would never fully heal. Survivor's guilt would pursue Gay for the remainder of his life. Cly also contemplated the Japanese sailors he had helped kill. As he dove on the Kaga, he had seen individual men on the flight deck, running to their stations, manning anti-aircraft guns, pushing burning aircraft overboard. They were not faceless abstractions or nameless enemy combatants. They were young men like himself, fighting for their country, serving their emperor. Many of them combat veterans who had flown since the invasion of China in 1937. Some had families, wives, children, dreams, all ending in fire that June morning. The ocean surrounding the Japanese fleet had been littered with bodies. Destroyers had rescued some, but thousands had died, burned by oil fires, attacked by sharks, or simply drowning in the vastness of the Pacific. War, Cly understood with a clarity that only combat could provide, was never clean or simple or glorious. It was young men dying far from home, their deaths serving purposes that transcended individual suffering. Historians would later designate the Battle of Midway as the Pacific War's turning point. In a single day, the naval power balance had shifted decisively. Japan had moved from carrier superiority to rough parity, and as American shipyards accelerated production, Japan would descend into increasingly desperate inferiority. Yet true victory, Clay came to understand, rested not merely on equipment or experience, but on the combination of combat power, equipment, training, experience, and morale that made forces effective. Japan had lost an entire generation of experienced pilots at Midway and subsequently at Guadalcanal through a process of attrition that could never be reversed. Japan's pilot training program produced perhaps 100 carrier pilots annually, a number that could not begin to match American production, which would soon generate thousands of trained aviators yearly. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later credit the victory to three factors: intelligence officers who broke the Japanese codes, damage control personnel who made the USS Yorktown operational again in 72 hours, when everyone insisted that 3 months would be required, and pilots who pressed attacks against overwhelming odds. Each element had been crucial. American victory at Midway also represented an industrial triumph. While the Battle of Midway was being fought, Essex-class carriers were under construction in American shipyards, vessels that dwarfed anything Japan could construct. America would ultimately build 24 Essex-class carriers. Japan, struggling to complete new carriers, mostly through conversion of existing hulls, could never produce vessels equal to American construction. Japan had entered the war possessing 6 large fleet carriers crewed by the world's best naval aviators. After Midway, only 2 operational carriers remained, with the core of experienced pilots destroyed. New carriers would be added to the fleet, but the trained pilots necessary to make those carriers effective would never be replaced. The carefully crafted force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had effectively died on June 4, 1942. Norman Ply survived the war, flying 85 combat missions. He was credited with striking 3 ships at Midway: the carriers, Kaga and Hiryu, and the cruiser Mikuma, and was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions. He retired as a captain in 1962 after service during the Korean War. He lived to the age of 100, passing away in 2016 among the last surviving Midway dive bomber pilots. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey recovered from his wounds and was promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral before retiring in 1956. He never sought recognition for the decision to follow the lone destroyer, a tactical choice that had fundamentally altered history's course. His son Phil later recalled his father as a quiet man, not given to self-promotion, who died in 1976, his pivotal role in history largely forgotten by the public. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, became a commercial pilot for TWA after the war. He spent decades speaking about his squadron's sacrifice, wrote a memoir titled Sole Survivor, and appeared regularly at Navy events to honor his fallen comrades. He died in 1994, and his ashes were scattered in the waters where his squadron had made its final attack, reuniting him with the men he had watched die 52 years earlier. Lieutenant Dick Best, who had sunk the Akagi with a single perfectly placed bomb, was medically retired after Midway. He had breathed caustic soda from a defective oxygen system, permanently damaging his lungs, and never flew again. Yet he lived until 2001, often called the man who won Midway, a title he carried with characteristic humility. Admiral Nagumo survived the battle but never recovered psychologically. He was relegated to shore commands and subsequently assigned to the defense of Saipan. As American forces overran the island in July 1944, he committed suicide rather than surrender. His chief of staff, Kusaka, survived and spent the post-war years writing extensively about the battle, accepting responsibility for tactical decisions while defending Nagumo's impossible choices. Captain Fuchida, the leader of the Pearl Harbor attack who had been aboard the Akagi during Midway, was wounded but survived with both ankles broken by explosion fragments. He escaped the burning carrier and in the post-war period became a Christian missionary dedicated to promoting reconciliation between Japan and America. He often said that at Midway, Japan lost the war in 5 minutes. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the entire operation, was killed in April 1943 when P-38 fighters acting on intelligence derived from decoded Japanese messages shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. After Midway, he reportedly told his staff, "I have killed many young men today," acknowledging the catastrophe that had unfolded under his command. Midway Island itself, where Marines had faced impossible odds against Japanese invasion forces, was designated a national memorial in 2000. The runway where battles had been fought became a wildlife sanctuary where albatrosses now nested peacefully in the place where bombs had fallen. Norman Clyde's account reminds us that the pilots who fought at Midway were not heroes in the romantic sense. They were young men doing necessary jobs, executing their training, flying their aircraft, dropping their bombs. The true heroes were the torpedo crews who knew they would die but went anyway. The codebreakers working in secrecy to penetrate Japanese communications. The mechanics keeping aircraft flying despite impossible demands, the damage control parties saving ships through extraordinary efforts, the corpsmen saving lives in circumstances that seemed to defy survival. Midway proved that wars are not won by those with the best equipment or most experienced warriors, but by those who can adapt to changing circumstances, seize opportunities as they arise, sustain losses, and continue fighting. The Japanese possessed better pilots and superior aircraft, but the Americans had broken Japanese codes, possessed functional radar systems, and maintained damage control capabilities that the Japanese lacked. American industrial capacity could replace losses 10 times over. Most critically, American leaders possessed the courage to make calculated risks. Admiral Nimitz risked the entire carrier force on potentially incorrect intelligence. McCluskey risked fuel exhaustion in pursuit of the Japanese fleet. Dick Best risked everything by attacking a different carrier with only 2 wingmen. John Waldron led his squadron toward death, knowing that the mission demanded it. The battle lasted 2 days, but it changed everything. Before Midway, Japan had been advancing everywhere, seemingly unstoppable. After Midway, Japan never won another offensive battle. The war would continue for 3 more terrible years, costing hundreds of thousands of additional lives. Yet the outcome had been decided in the space of minutes when dive bombers caught Japan's carriers with armed aircraft on their decks. Small decisions, chance moments, individual choices had determined the fates of nations. But history deals in what actually occurred. On June 4, 1942, outnumbered American pilots flying inferior aircraft caught the world's most powerful carrier force at maximum vulnerability and destroyed it. They turned the war's tide through intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and fortune. Today's generation cannot fully imagine democracy itself endangered, freedom's survival questioned. But in June 1942, that reality was palpable and terrifying. The free world's fate rested on a few hundred pilots from 3 carriers scattered across the mid-Pacific. They were enough. Against odds that defied logic, against a force possessed of superior training and equipment, they were enough. That is Midway's essential lesson. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can rise to meet them. Democracy produces warriors as brave as any totalitarian system. Free men fighting for their homes and families represent the Earth's most powerful force. The numbers tell part of the story. 357 Japanese dead, 362 Americans. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk. 1 American carrier damaged beyond repair. Yet statistics obscure the human reality. Each number represented a human being with hopes, dreams, fears, and loved ones. Each death was a tragedy. Young men who should have seen grandchildren were instead consumed by fire and water. The Pacific Ocean remained unchanged, unmarked by battle, the coordinates where carriers sank merely ocean patches indistinguishable from surrounding waters. But humanity must remember. The memory must endure as long as free people exist. Midway and its men must be remembered. They saved the world in devastating minutes. 4 carriers, the Imperial Navy's pride, were reduced to burning hulks in the time it took to eat breakfast. The war's course, a nation's fate, freedom's future, all decided by dive bomber pilots pressing attacks against impossible odds. That is the legacy. Not merely victory, but example. When tyranny threatens, free people rise. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. Sometimes the world's fate rests on a few brave individuals, and ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things. Midway's dead, American and Japanese alike, deserve remembrance as humans who gave their lives serving their countries. American pilots flying toward death to protect freedom. Japanese sailors dying while attempting to save burning ships. All brave men deserving better than dying young in the Pacific's middle. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Freedom survived and flourished. The Pacific, once a battlefield, became peaceful, traveled by merchants rather than warships. Japan and America, bitter enemies, became close allies. The war, which seemed endless, passed into history. Soon, none will remain who can say, "I was there." I saw Kaga explode. I watched Akagi burn. I dove through flak to hit my target. But the story endures and must endure, because free people valuing human life need to know that freedom is not free. It is purchased with the blood of men climbing into obsolete torpedo planes, flying toward certain death, diving through walls of flak, hitting their targets, giving everything, stopping tyranny. That is what Midway accomplished. It stopped tyranny, saved freedom, changed history. In world-altering minutes on a clear June morning in 1942, when the world's fate balanced precariously, American pilots tipped the scales decisively toward freedom.